Good evening, everyone. Buenas tardes. I hope everyone is having a wonderful evening. My name is Jonathan Camboris. I'm the site manager here at the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor. And today we have a very special and warming welcome that you've provided us throughout this Hispanic Heritage Month. This is now our third hosted lecture here at the museum, and we are so honored for that privilege. Today, we are going to have introduced Dr. Martha Palanti. She is the Charles Darling Endowed Chair for Social and American History. She has been a mentor to me throughout my tenure at YSU and in my new position now. So warmly, I welcome Ms. Martha Palanti. Thank you.
I'm amongst the vertically challenged, so we got to bring it down a little bit. I do want to welcome everyone here tonight. It's a real privilege for myself and for the Darling Endowment to provide sponsorship for this very important event. I'd like to thank Ana Torres for the opportunity to do it and to provide cooperation for this event. Having said that, it's my real privilege tonight to introduce Dr. Alvaro Ramirez. He's originally from a small farming village in Michoacan, Mexico, and he immigrated to Ohio when he was 12 years old with his family. He obtained a bachelor's degree from YSU, and in talking, we actually decided that we overlapped a little bit in our schooling here. I'm much older. He earned a master's and a doctorate degree from the University of Southern California. Dr. Ramirez has taught a travel course starting in 1995, and since 2000 has directed a semester-long study abroad program in Cuernavaca, Mexico. He splits most of his time between Mexico and the United States. These unique travel experiences and classroom discussions with St. Mary's College students over the years have inspired his book, Postcards from a Post-Mexican. It was awarded the Victor Villaseñor Best Latino-Focused Nonfiction Bronze Prize Award at the 2021 International Latino Book Awards. His collection of short stories, Los Norteados, received an honorable mention in 2017 International Latino Book Awards. Dr. Ramirez has taught courses on Latin American and Spanish literature, Mexican Chicano culture, as well as Mexican film. Tonight, for our pleasure, he will present Latinas and Latinos in Ohio, a brief history of their diasporic condition. Latin American immigrants have formed part of the economic, socio-political, and cultural texture of the Ohio Valley for over a century. Their presence at times has been almost invisible as they help to build thriving communities. Now, they have gained visibility for political reasons and have come back under attack. One reason is the lack of knowledge to the conditions that have driven these immigrants to move from their home countries to the United States, where they aspire to join in the venture of creating and being part of this strong nation. This talk will shed light on those who those immigrants are, where they come from, and why they decided to make the arduous and occasionally dangerous trek northward from Latin America. And most importantly, why this movement of people continues to greatly contribute to the benefit of the United States. Dr. Alvaro.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. It's a very, very real pleasure for me to be here today in my old alma mater, YSU. I have so many nice memories talking to Dr. Marta Palante, uh, I was just harking back to the days when I walked around here with so many of my friends. And it's a place that is still, after 40 years, it's very deep, way down deep inside my heart. Uh, USC, everybody, when I was at USC, people used to ask me, do you like USC better than YSU, California better than Ohio? They got very mad when I said Ohio, you know? So how could you like Ohio better than California? Easily, easily. I know. Easily, I easily, that choice was very easy to make. But it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the people involved in organizing this event. Obviously, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Marta Palante, and she's the she she organizes these type of events, as she explained to you, through the Charles Darling Endowment for American Culture and Social History. I'm very pleased that she's involved in this type of event that we need in order to inform people more of the diverse people that are in California, the diversity that we've always had, of all kind, not just Latinos and Latinas, but also Europeans, Asian Americans, and others. It's very important for us to have this type of events and discussions. I also want to thank Ana Torres, who convinced me to to come also. She was very instrumental in organizing, as well as Dr. Palante, organizing this event and making it very easy for me to come back to my alma mater and be here with you today. Another, obviously, I want to thank all of my family who is here today. It seems like I said we could easily turn this into a party. Okay. Uh, we just run down the street, get some beer, and we'll have a party. But it's a pleasure, and I think for me it's a real pleasure because just about everybody's here. I know you, or have seen you, or have somehow connection to you through my family, and for that reason, I would like to, dedicate this talk that I'm going to do to all of you from Youngstown, Ohio, who I still feel today, especially as I'm here in front of you and walking around talking to people, I feel so much part of you still. Even after having been in California for 42 years, I feel like I'm from Michoacan, and then from Youngstown, and then California, in that order. So without much more delay, I'm going to read here my talk on Latinas and Latinos in Ohio. It's a brief history to give you an idea of how Latinos have participated in the life of Ohio. And also, though, I want to contextualize it in a bigger picture of the US, now, of other groups have also been here and how we fit in. Towards the end, I will finish by explaining some of the more, I would say, the transformations that have happened today, so that you understand a little bit as to how Latinos and Latinas who have arrived lately in the last 40 years or so, how they are different from the ones who arrived when we were here in the 60s, and how they're different from the ones who arrived back in the 20s, when really the Latino population set itself up in the Mahoning Valley. Okay, so anyways, I'll start here to read. I will be clicking here some pictures that I uh, that I took. We'll start here. Later on, if you have any questions, I welcome them, especially about the pictures. If you want me to explain a little more about what these pictures are about, or who are the ones that are being depicted. When I was a young boy living in Mexico, time and space seemed to stand still. Nothing changed. Most people live their lives within a short distance of the place in which they were born and raised. Going on a trip to a nearby city was a trip of a lifetime, and traveling to the nation's capital, Mexico City, was like going to the moon. People lucky enough to go on such trips saw strange, fascinating places and things, which gave them a special aura among the townspeople. Much like the gypsy Melquiades in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel 100 Years of Solitude, they came back full of magical tales about the world out there beyond the circle of mountains that surrounded our town. My family broke through that physical barrier after my father, a former bracero, that is, a guest worker, received U.S. resident status and decided to bring his family north through the Family Reunification Clause of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, and moved our family from our small town, Copándaro, Michoacán, to Youngstown, Ohio. At that time, migration was the exception, not the rule. After moving to El Norte, I found out that not only in Mexico, but also in the US, there was not a lot of human movement. People lived in geographical containers called countries and nations with distinct inhabitants we call French, Mexican, Argentinians, English, etc., with their cultures and languages tightly bound within national borders. And though some people did have the opportunity to go on trips and a few moved to another country, for the most part, people seemed to stay put in their place of birth. When my parents made the courageous move north, we had little idea that we were taking part in the beginning of a massive migration that would change Mexico and the US. The US itself had experienced various waves of migration during the 19th and most of the 20th century. This was evident in Youngstown as we settled in a neighborhood in the west side populated by Italians, Polish, Slavs, Ukrainians, and Croatians, most of whom had arrived during the Great Migration between 1880 and 1920. These were the unmeltable ethnics that Michael Novak famously analyzed in his eponymous book published in 1971. In the main, Novak argued that the melting pot process which led to Americanization had failed to fully amalgamate these European ethnics into the US nation. They were not fully uprooted, as Oscar Handlin posed in an earlier book. Underneath a layer of acculturation, they still maintain their roots, however tenuous, to faraway communities that historically and culturally still tied the Eastern and Southern European immigrants to their original homelands. This situation had given rise to an ethnic consciousness that was reshaping the political and cultural landscape in the US. When I first read Michael Novak's book, The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethnics, as an undergraduate here at YSU, I was surprised that he paid scant attention to immigrants from Latin America. At times, he mentioned Chicanos and Spanish, yet their experiences were not included in his study. Novak's omission of these ethnic groups can be explained for several reasons. First, he states clearly that the focus of his inquiry are the Europeans, immigrants, and their descendants that had arrived within the last century. Second, although the Immigration Act of 1924 had not limited the entry of Latin American immigrants into the U.S., their percentage in the American population was very low. For example, the census of 1970 puts the Mexican American population at a mere 1%, most of whom were located in the American Southwest. Thus, Mexicans were merely a bleep on the ethnic radar in the late 60s when Novak was writing his book. Third, although in the previous decades, Manuel Gamio and Kerry McWilliams had published important books on Mexican migrant work in California, studies on these immigrants were still scarce in the 70s. It would be years before academic researchers would pay serious attention to the experience of Latin American immigrants, not just from Mexico, but from Puerto Rico and Cuba, two other regions that, for different reasons, sent robust waves of immigrants to the US between World War I and the end of the Vietnam War. It is possible to surmise, then, that Novak and other contemporary researchers studying immigration lack crucial information and knowledge about this small group of ethnics from Latin America whose numbers would soon increase as a result of massive immigration or immigrant waves from Mexico and Central America, sending the US into a major crisis in the 1980s, a crisis that has yet to be resolved. These scholars were certainly aware of the presence of Chicanos. Some pictures of some early Mexicans here, trackers that we will talk about more. They certainly knew, these scholars were certainly aware of the presence of the Chicano movement and its four charismatic leaders that were making political noise throughout the Southwest in the late 60s and early 70s. They knew of Reyes Tijerina's struggle to reclaim lands in New Mexico taken illegally by Americans after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a treaty that allowed the U.S. to annex half of Mexico in 1848. They were aware of Ángel Gutiérrez, who had founded Ángel Gutiérrez, who had founded La Raza Unida Party in Texas, which won important electoral victories, putting Mexican Americans into political office. They were mindful of Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, who orchestrated the cultural movement that would resonate in high schools and universities across the Southwest, and that would lead to a Chicano renaissance in arts and literature. And of course, they certainly knew of Cesar Chavez, of his long fight to unionize California field workers, a struggle that had gotten the media's attention, as well as the attention of politicians like Bobby Kennedy, who began to pander for the Mexican American vote. Novak and other scholars working in the East Coast most likely deemed this political turmoil as pertaining mainly to the Southwest, because in the eastern U.S., the presence of Mexicans and their descendants was negligible. In this sense, they were right. The numbers confirmed it. Between 1880 and 1920, 20 million Europeans arrived, whereas between 1848 and 1930, the Mexican population residing in the U.S. had only increased to 1 million inhabitants, most of whom, as we shall soon see, would be deported by 1940. Therefore, the lack of information and the minor presence of a Mexican population in the East Coast may explain why, in the 70s, immigration studies concentrated largely on European immigrants, much to the detriment of Latinos and Latinas. It is not far-fetched to imagine that at this point, in most people's minds, immigration to the U.S. still referred to Europeans that had arrived through Ellis Island. The Statue of Liberty at the entrance to the harbor of New York City symbolized and celebrated their arrival in the United States. To most Americans, the southern border and West Coast were not an issue with regard to immigration. It was supposed to be under control. After all, the U.S. government had established laws prohibiting entry from China in 1885, and the Gentleman's Agreement ended immigration from Japan in 1905. As for the southern border, a vast desert served as a buffer, discouraging northward movement of people from Mexico. Consequently, Americans had little concern for what was happening at the U.S.-Mexico border. They were, however, very wrong in this respect. The fact is that around the turn of the century, various developments had quickly changed the situation at the southern border. In 1902, the Land Reclamation Act ushered in American agribusiness in the West, particularly in California, creating big agricultural enterprises that required a large workforce. To fix this labor gap, the U.S. began to recruit workers from the central part of Mexico. The recruitment was facilitated by low wages paid in Mexican haciendas and the cheap transportation provided by a recently American-built railroad that connected central Mexico to El Paso, Texas. The railroad's purpose was the rapid transport of commercial goods between the two countries, but ended up accelerating the back and forth movement of people. Thus, in the first decade of the 20th century, circular migration became a fact of life for many Mexicans. This movement of people grew exponentially with a booming American economy that demanded a workforce that the U.S. lacked. The scarcity of workers for the country was especially problematic after it became involved in the First World War, which internally dislocated individuals from the countryside to the cities. This relocation of the American population left a void in agriculture that was filled by the most readily available, cheap, and mobile workforce, the Mexicans next door. The need for this labor became even more acute after the Immigration Act of 1924 basically closed the door to immigrants from Europe. Thus, by the end of the Roaring '20s, communities of Mexicans could be found everywhere in the U.S., from Texas to Minnesota and from California to New York. It was in this context that Mexicans from Puerto Rico and Mexicans and Puerto Ricans arrived in Ohio. The relocation, however, had different push and pull factors, or root causes, as politicians like to call them nowadays. By the beginning of the 20th century, Mexicans were already migrating to Texas in considerable numbers to work in the cotton fields and in the railroads. However, the Mexican Revolution of 1910 would alter radically this migration pattern after it turned into a 10-year civil war that caused a mass exodus from Mexico to the United States. In fact, one must understand the sociopolitical and economic repercussions of the Mexican Revolution to understand the different waves of the Mexican diaspora that ensued during the 20th century. The first to arrive were refugees fleeing the ruthless fighting in the cities and countryside. Some of these exiles stayed in Texas, waiting to return to Mexico after the hostilities subsided. Others headed for California. Soon, the sugar beet industry of the Midwest took advantage of this pool of cheap labor at their disposal and began to contract Mexicans to replace their original workers, mostly Eastern European immigrants who had been lured away by factory jobs in urban areas. It was not long before many Mexicans were in a circular migration pattern. They spent the sugar beet season in the Midwest and then returned to Texas to work in the citrus and cotton industry. Others went further south and returned to their original villages, only to make the trip to the Midwest once more the following year. As they repeated this circular migration, they convinced other relatives and friends to join them. Most of these workers were young and single, but many families migrated intact as American farmers found it more economical to hire entire families, regardless of age, to work as units in the backbreaking work of the beet fields. To ensure a nearby pool of cheap labor, farmers eventually offered cheap, low housing for rent. This led to many Mexican families establishing themselves permanently in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, and Ohio. By 1917, for instance, there was a considerable presence of Mexicans around Toledo, Ohio, who worked in the sugar beet industry. As these families settled, the males began to branch out in search for other type of employment. Many found jobs as trackmen in one of the railroad companies that serviced the region. Others ended up in meat packing companies. Still others found employment in the incipient car industry. And above all, they were hired to produce the steel that built the cities of America. In the 1920s, a larger wave of Mexicans arrived, just as the U.S. was experiencing a boom in the steel and car industry, which this time was luring Mexican workers away from the sugar beet industry, as well as attracting the men arriving from Mexico. These Mexicans found steady work in steel mills in Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. By 1923, there was a sizable number of them working in Lorain, Ohio, in the National Tube Company. Others began to fan out further into Cleveland and Youngstown, as well as into Pittsburgh and other steel-producing areas of Pennsylvania. I have always used the story of my dear uncle, Antonio Ceja, to illustrate how these immigrants ended up in places like the Mahoning Valley. Mi tío Tony, as we lovingly call him, started as a typical circular migrant, moving from the state of Michoacán to Texas during the first years of the revolution. That's him up there. After working for a short period, he returned to his village. There, he married mi tía Estefania, that's her right there, and again made the trek to find work in Laredo, Texas, where they had a child, and returned for another visit to Michoacán. Once more, my uncle and young family departed to the US, but this time headed out further north into Missouri, then Chicago, Illinois, following the availability of jobs. Finally, in the mid-1920s, mi tío Tony and some friends heard there were jobs in Pittsburgh and got on a train to Pennsylvania. They made a stop in Youngstown and got off to see how the working situation looked there. They obtained jobs and decided to stay in the Mahoning Valley. Mi tío Tony then sent for mi tía Estefania and their children and settled permanently in Youngstown, where he worked for U.S. Steel until he retired in, Lina? When did he retire? You remember? I say 1960 because we came 66 and he was already living the life. And he deserved it, to live the life. As stated earlier, by 1930, there were approximately 1 million Mexican immigrants residing in the United States. Over 5,000 of them, were dispersed in northern Ohio, primarily in Lorain, Cleveland, Toledo, and Youngstown, working in a variety of industrial jobs, and some in farming. These communities were thriving when they went through what has been the darkest period of Mexican immigrants in the United States, the Great Depression. The sudden loss of jobs hit the Mexican population as hard as any other ethnic community living in the country. As has been the case every time the U.S. suffers an economic downturn, Americans search for an ethnic group on whom to place the blame. Unfortunately, on this occasion, Mexicans, the Mexican population, received the distinction of being the scapegoat, as they were unfairly blamed for the economic troubles that afflicted the U.S. Chicano historians have chronicled the traumatic experience hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans went through during these dark years. Francisco Valderrama and Raymond Rodriguez's excellent book, Decade of Betrayal, Mexican Repatriation in the 1930s, sheds light on the atrocities of a massive deportation that transpired during the Great Depression. Before this important study was published in 1995, little was known about this harrowing event and the systematic manner in which local, state, and federal agencies colluded to coerce Mexicans, maybe as many as 1 million, into leaving the country. In their zealous efforts to oust Mexicans, government officials created two pernicious myths about these immigrants that one can still hear today. First, that Mexicans take jobs away from real Americans, who I don't know who the hell they are. And second, that Mexicans take advantage of welfare programs. So a bunch of crap. Both are patently untrue. Valderrama and Rodriguez document the appalling disregard for the law, for the Constitution, and the gross violation of human rights openly committed by cynical government officials in their endeavors to deport, or as they called it, to repatriate Mexicans, knowing full well it would not improve in any way the dire conditions of the American populace. I find the title of Valderrama and Rodriguez's book very apt, Decade of Betrayal. It was a betrayal because Mexicans had been some of the most loyal industrial productive workers that created vast amount of wealth for Americans. It was a betrayal because many children born and raised in the U.S. had been illegally deported along with their parents. It was a betrayal because these children were citizens who loved their country, the United States, a fact they proved when they joined the armed forces after Japan attacked the U.S. Ironically, many of the deportees even returned voluntarily from Mexico to fight the enemies of the nation that had rejected them so harshly just a few years earlier. Midwest Mexicans were part of the greatest generation. Let us not forget that. So venerated in the U.S. at the present time. They distinguished themselves gallantly in World War II, even though we hear very little about their contributions to the war effort in history books. In fact, they won in proportion to the population more Congressional Medals of Honor than any group. The deportation, I call it, the deportation witch hunt let loose during the Great Depression decimated the Mexican population in the Mahoning Valley as much as it did other similar communities in the rest of the country. But many people, my uncle, Tony Ceja included, held firm and weathered out the storm. The loss of jobs also stemmed the flow of immigrants from Mexico into the Ohio Valley, and this region would never see significant numbers again until the 1980s. It must be stressed that the Second World War changed dramatically the immigration flows from Mexico to the U.S. I just want to show a picture of that's my uncle. And this is a picture of, obviously, those of us old enough to remember. I think it's McDonald's, no? Steel, U.S. Steel, isn't it? It looks like the McDonald's U.S. Steel. I can smell it. And I can feel the dust falling all over the place. It must be stressed that the Second World War changed dramatically the immigration flow from Mexico to the U.S. due to the Bracero program. The first phase of the program, which was in effect from 1942 to 1946, or 47 actually, did not have a noticeable impact in Ohio. But for my family, it set the wheels in motion for our eventual immigration to the United States, or to Youngstown, because of this guy. At 22 years of age, my father, Jose Felimon Ramirez Aguilera, joined this guest worker program, which played an essential role in winning the Second World War, as these workers were essential for providing the food and helping to maintain the railroads that kept the war machine moving in the U.S. After victory over the Axis powers, the U.S. decided to end the Bracero program. But a funny thing happened. The agricultural sector in the Western U.S. had become heavily dependent, I would say addicted, on Mexican cheap labor, especially in California. The dependency was so dire that if the U.S. stopped the flow of Mexican workers, agribusiness enterprises were willing to hire them illegally. Thus began a problem that has haunted the country until the present day. And I want to stress here, when people talk about illegals in the U.S. started the problem. U.S. businesses started the problem of illegals because they didn't want to follow the rules of the Bracero program. Given this reliance on cheap labor, Congress was forced to renew twice the guest worker program in 1947 and in 1955. Finally, ending the program in 1964, leaving the issue of the undocumented unresolved. The program had other significant consequences. First, it reestablished a circular migration pattern that lasted until 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act that Ronald Reagan signed into law. Second, as most braceros returned for many years to work with the same employers in the U.S., they set the basis in American cities and towns that would eventually grow into colonies of Mexican workers after the amnesty of 1986. It is important to point out that the braceros were politically and culturally different from the previous ways of Mexican immigration. They were the sons of the Mexican Revolution and had been raised with revolutionary ideals propagated through a socialist education. When they arrived in the U.S., they were confronted by the newly minted Mexican-American ethnics, which historian George Sanchez contends could already be found in 1940 in cities like Los Angeles. Braceros and Mexican Americans had cultural similarities, but very strong political differences due to the two different educational systems that produced them. Being strong nationalists, the Braceros could not accept the addition of American to Mexican, so they found it hard to accept Mexican Americans in equal terms, calling them by the pejorative moniker pochos, meaning Americanized Mexicans. When my family arrived in Youngstown in the late 60s, we encountered, and this is my mommy, her, my dad, and her. They're our heroes in my family. They're the ones that made that move that changed all of us. And because of those two people making that courageous move to move here, I'm now here talking to you. It is important to point out that Braceros were politically and culturally different It is important to point out that Braceros were politically and culturally different from the previous. I already read that. When my family arrived in Youngstown in the late 60s, we encountered a robust Mexican-American community, many of whom are right here, especially my family right here, the Montmores. And there's a couple of Rachel, there's other people around here. We arrived in when they were little kids, and they were young. They were like the 30-somethings. We did not see pochos, but a group of people who mixed English and Spanish without missing a beat, and whose culture seemed quaint and out of touch with what was happening in Mexico at the time. In retrospect, I believe my family viewed them in terms of the unmeltable ethnics that Michael Novak describes so well in his book, because beneath that American cultural life lay the Mexican ethnic that surfaced now and then inside of these people. The nucleus of the community was the Sociedad Mutualista Mexicana, founded in 1937. This mutual aid society had galvanized 3 generations of Mexicans into a social unit as it provided an array of services to its members in times of trouble and helped maintain and cultivate Mexican cultural traditions and patriotic celebrations such as Cinco de Mayo and Mexican Independence Day. Members of the community had found employment in a variety of jobs in steelwork, railroad, farming, education, nursing, and photography, among others. Some were on their way to higher education to become engineers and lawyers. It was a robust community indeed, and it would remain stable until a new wave of Mexican immigrants began to arrive in the 1980s. My family found a way to coexist with the 3 generations of Mexicans living in Youngstown. We returned to Michoacan for brief visits now and then, which enabled us to maintain a strong bond to Mexican nationalism. But eventually, the family began to slowly assimilate to the quaint bicultural life of Mexican Americans. Interestingly, upon our arrival, we also had contact with another group of Latin Americans whose immigrant experience has also left an important footprint in Ohio. I now turn to this ethnic group. The Puerto Rican community has a rich history in the Mahoning Valley. It is, however, quite distinct from the Mexican experience. After Puerto Rico became a territory of the U.S. in 1998, Puerto Ricans began to migrate to the mainland in search of work. In the first decade of the 20th century, the number of immigrants from the island was relatively low, and most headed to Florida, New York, and Hawaii. The upswing in the American economy of the roaring 20s attracted over 40,000 Puerto Ricanos, a move made easy by the 1917 Jones Act, which granted American citizenship to the island inhabitants. The U.S. corporations gained control of the sugar industry of Puerto Rico and turned its economy on its head, which they usually do everywhere they go. This caused the departure of thousands of Puerto Ricans from the island. New York remained the main destination, but many started to settle in other parts of the nation, including Philadelphia and Chicago. In the 1930s, there was a decline in migration from the island, obviously by the effect of the Great Depression. But soon after World War II ended, a massive migration took place, quite similar to the wave of immigrants from Mexico after the revolution. For instance, many Puerto Ricans came to the U.S. under contract to do a variety of jobs, thus establishing circular migration patterns. As these migrants, mostly young men, returned to the island, many enticed other family friends to follow suit. By 1950, thousands had found their way to the Midwest, to cities such as Chicago and Gary, Indiana. In 1947, 500 Puerto Ricans arrived in Lorain, Ohio, contracted by the National Tube Company. Interestingly, Eugenio Rivera, an anthropologist, points out that when the city's inhabitants found out that they had brought these 500 Puerto Ricans in, they were not very pleased. The steel company, however, justified it and fought them and said that they were right to bring these Puerto Rican workers because of their excellent work ethic. And thus, they were able to allay animosity towards these migrants. In the early 1950s, the Boricuas began to arrive in Youngstown, Ohio. The story of our neighbor, Don Silverio Cruz, is illustrative of their journey. Like many Puerto Ricans, Don Silverio served proudly in World War II in the Philippines, then returned to the island where he got married and started a family. As the industrialization policies of Operation Bootstrap began to play havoc on the island's economy, our neighbor, along with many other inhabitants from the Puerto Rican countryside, called Jibaros, joined the migration wave to the U.S. First, he worked in New York and finally moved to the Mahoning Valley, where Don Silverio found employment in the Cheatham Tube Company in Briar Hill until he also retired in the 1960s. The Puerto Rican population of Youngstown continued to increase over the next 2 decades, and eventually most settled in the city's east side. It was a unique community, for though it lacked a nation, it had a strong ethnic nationalism. Because that's something people don't remember. Puerto Rico has never been a country, ever. But they sure as hell make you think they have one, because of that pride that they have. As was the case with many other ethnic communities of its kind, its nucleus was a church, Santa Rosa de Lima, located on Himrod Avenue, but many years later moved to Lowellville Road. Through its many activities, religious services, masses, catechism classes, dances, and its renowned summer festival that I loved, Santa Rosa provided the social glue that bonded the Puerto Rican population of Youngstown. Anyone who attended any of these activities could immediately feel the pride of the community, a pride justified on account of the many accomplishments of its members, not the least of which was that they had traveled thousands of miles to successfully establish a thriving Puerto Rican enclave, which kept alive and transmitted its traditions and culture to the following generations. The presence of a vibrant community, Latino community, in the Mahoning Valley could still be felt in the 1980s. I left in 1982. The majority continued to be of Mexican and Puerto Rican descent. However, the closing of the mills had a profound negative impact on the Youngstown Warren area. Latino and Latina residents suffered greatly as a result. Many Hispanics joined the mass exodus that has ensued for the last 40 years, particularly the young. But as was the case with the Great Depression, the community has shown in its resilience and has survived this long economic catastrophe. Today, unfortunately, La Sociedad Mutualista Mexicana is but a shadow of its former self. And the Church of Santa Rosa de Lima has disappeared. And with it, the institution that united both Puerto Ricans and Mexicans. I'm talking about La Sociedad Mutualista and St. Rosa Lima. They brought them together in some sense. Still, Latinos in the area have not completely lost their cultural cohesiveness. In part, this is because of the large waves of immigrants that have entered the U.S. in the last 40 years. Enticed by the prospect of jobs in the Midwest, the South, and the East Coast, these newcomers spread out from the traditional Latino enclaves of California and Texas, where jobs had become scarce due to an excess of immigrants from Mexico and Central America. In the summer of 2002, I drove with my family from San Francisco Bay Area all the way to Maine. In small towns such as Elko, Nevada, or big cities like Omaha, Nebraska, we encountered Mexicans. In every major metropolis we passed through, we heard Mexican music on the radio. Mexican restaurants seem to be everywhere too. In the Peabody Museum in Harvard, I noticed a man tidying up a display. We made eye contact. We made eye contact for a few seconds. I greeted him in Spanish. He answered me back in Spanish, typical of rural Mexico. In a small restaurant in Maine, I could hear the Mexican-Spanish banter of workers in the kitchen who, I presume, were preparing my lobster sandwich. I smiled and thought to myself, we are back to the pre-1930 times, before the great witch hunt, before the great betrayal, when Mexicans resided in productive communities in most of the United States. In fact, today they can be found again in all 50 states of the nation. As of 2002, the U.S. Census shows that the Latino population stands at 63.7 million, or 19.1% of the total population. That is almost 20 times what it was in 1970. Nearly 1 of every 5 inhabitants is a Latino or Latina. Of these, 37.5 million, roughly 60%, are of Mexican origin. As for Puerto Ricans, their number stands at 3.2 million, or 9.3% of the U.S. Hispanics. Salvadorians, Cubans, and Dominicans each have over 2 million inhabitants dispersed throughout the American Union. Guatemalan, Colombians, Hondurans show well over 1 million each. Although not a preferred destination since 1980, Ohio has seen a large upsurge in the arrival of foreign people. Its current population is estimated at around 500,000, or 4.8% of the state's population. Still, this is one of the lowest Latino populations in the U.S. based on percentages. The cities with the largest Latino numbers are Columbus, Toledo, Lorain, and Cleveland. Closer to home, according to Data USA, the Mahoning Valley has 14,400 Hispanics. That is 7.6% of its population. Youngstown may be the incredible shrinking city, but its Hispanic population has grown slightly. At 6,730, it represents 11.2% of its inhabitants. Surprisingly, though, India is the most common birthplace of recent immigrants to the Mahoning Valley, followed by Mexicans and Pakistani, which to me, when I saw it, was like, where the hell did this come from? I love Indians and Pakistanis. The food is good. Any way you look at it, these numbers demonstrate we are now living in what Sigmund Bauman, a social critic, calls the age of diasporas, meaning dispersion of people. At the beginning of this talk, I compared nation states to geographic containers that restricted their population within national borders. Well, those containers sprung leaks, particularly after the end of the Cold War, and unleash worldwide massive migrations of people that have caused havoc everywhere, confounding notions of nationality, ethnicity, citizenship, and culture. This human movement has been mainly from third world countries to Western Europe, Canada, and the United States. It has lately accelerated to such a degree that it is raising lots of concern among the receiving countries. Many Westerners have a deep fear of this new disorder. The hybrid nature of the diasporic world is confounding them. They desire to go back to geographical containers with their neat and distinct borders, with authentic national cultures, which were never so authentic in the first place. But no matter how hard they try to plug the holes in the geographic containers, another leak will spring. You cannot stop the movement of people. Politicians everywhere have seized on this fear and politicized it to the nth degree. When Donald Trump promotes to deport 20 million undocumented, I say he should first read Valderrama and Rodriguez's book, Decade of Betrayal, and hopefully he'll see the nefarious consequences and futility of such deportations. Kamala Harris talks of fixing the root causes of immigration from Latin America. I say, well, first you have to read lots of history books on the subject, which I know she has not. American politicians are notoriously ignorant of the internal wars, foreign invasions, American Cold War policies, failed revolutions, economic and national catastrophes that have impelled Latin Americans to leave their place of birth. Only when they understand these historic underlying social, political, and economic causes will they be able to propose viable solutions and reduce immigration. I say reduce because in our modern world, it has become impossible to stop immigration. In fact, it is a necessity for many Western countries, such as the US, in order to keep their economies afloat, especially now that many young Americans are opting for childless marriages and fail to realize that the wonderful way of life they want to enjoy without children needs a big supporting cast of workers. I do not believe Americans oppose immigration per se. They know the workforce needs to be reproduced in one way or another. Their concern and fear have to do more with the arrival of millions of immigrants with different cultures who will resist assimilation into American culture. If they only understood, the Americans, if the Americans only understood how globalization is transforming the world in their favor, Americans might put aside their fears. The case of Mexico is emblematic of what is happening in this regard in the descending countries of Latin America. Perhaps globalization has not affected any other country in the world as it has Mexico, because we're right next door to the monster. As you know, the famous saying, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. Well, that's our problema. Perhaps globalization has not affected any other country in the world as it has Mexico, a country that created a unique national culture and merged people into a unified nation, and that was widely recognized around the world. Throughout the 20th century, waves of Mexican immigrants brought to the U.S. different versions of the national culture, which means we're not all the same. Mexicans arrived in Ohio, we have all been different culturally. However, in 1994, things changed dramatically when the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, unleashed upon Mexico a tsunami of American products that inundated the country. The opening of markets had tremendous consequences for the southern neighbor and has given birth to what I call the NAFTA generation, a cohort of Mexicans that has grown up fully immersed in American culture, popular culture, and whose cultural alliances can be put into question or have been put into question. The NAFTA generation, here they are. I'm going to show you some picture of braceros. Then we'll jump to the NAFTA generation. Braceros means hands, no? Brazos, arms, braceros. But you can see the beautiful picture of workers in the fields who put these are braceros coming into, here they are working. I always imagine my dad telling me stories of him working like that, or picking apples in Washington. And I can see him there. These are what I'm talking about now. The NAFTA generation is quite at home at gallerias, faithful replicas of US malls, where you can find them buying American clothes and visiting the food court to eat at Chili's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, or to drink coffee at Starbucks. The NAFTA generation are also faithful customers of American holidays like Valentine's Day, Easter, Halloween, Christmas. They are eager to consume all the material trappings that go along with these festivities. Academic American music is extremely popular throughout the country. It is common to hear 70s, 80s, and 90s music while you eat your lunch or dinner at many restaurants. Well, you also hear it in taxis, buses, and of course, in bars, particularly bars that cater to the Mexican hipster crowd. Mexico's youth has a penchant for everything from Metallica to Ariana Grande and Lady Gaga. The Taylor Swift phenomena is as strong in Mexico as anywhere else in the world. As you walk around, you'll see young Mexicans wearing t-shirts of Nirvana, Guns N' Roses, the Ramones, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and many other rock groups. When it comes to watching films in Mexico, well, it means watching American films. Very few Mexicans go to see movies produced in Mexico. Roughly 95% of movies viewed in Mexico are from the US. It's almost as if Mexican audiences consider Mexican film foreign. Television viewership follows the same pattern. Telenovelas, of course, still have a large following among the lower classes. The middle classes and upper classes, though, of all ages, are fanatics of American television fare, such as SpongeBob, The Simpsons. And they're huge fans of platforms such as Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon, Hulu, Roku, whatever. You can discuss with them series such as Game of Thrones without a problem. To me, it's embarrassing sometimes because I sit down to eat with some college professors and they begin to ask me, so have you seen Game of Thrones? I say, I've never seen it. And they're like, well, what the hell's wrong with you? And I say, throw it back at you. What the hell's wrong with you? You know? American sports are also immensely popular. There they are. 49ers played at the Aztec Stadium. Again, 100,000 people filled that stadium to watch the 49ers. 49ers and the Dallas Cowboys are the most popular teams. And I don't like it because my team is the Raiders. But now, the most popular team seems to be gaining on the 49ers and Dallas is the Chiefs because of Mahomes. Okay? Let me continue. American sports are also immensely popular among the people of all ages in Mexico. Football in particular is very prominent. Mexicans follow the games every weekend, and their passion culminates in February when they get together at parties and pack sports bars to cheer for their favorite team in the Super Bowl. NASCAR has its followers thanks to the success of Checo Perez, a Mexican, one of the top drivers in the world of racing. Baseball has always been popular in the north and southeast of Mexico. Ex-President López Obrador is one of the biggest fans. The extreme quantity of American goods consumed in Mexico is having a noticeable effect on our society for other reasons. Any foreigner who visits a city or mid-sized town south of the border will immediately notice the ubiquity of English language. It is in store signs, the name of schools, businesses, and products. It is fashionable to give newborn kids English names. Karens and Kevins have become the new Marias and Joses. If you still get a Spanish name at birth, it's common for your friends to call you by a nickname in English. Advertisements in magazines are full of English words and phrases. Sometimes the whole advertisement is in English. Newspaper opinion writers regularly drop into their articles words such as fast track, nearshore, and gaslighting. Why? Because an ever-growing portion of the Mexican population is bilingual. This should come as no surprise, given that many children from all social strata are enrolled in English classes from preschool through college. It's a law in Mexico that the government passed, that children have to take English classes. The only reason it doesn't work well because they don't have enough English teachers. What is more, from an early age, Mexicans are exposed to English, I already said, television programs, film, videos, cartoons, music, toys, etc. Interest in English is such that many people seem to avoid dubbed films and movie theaters. This exposure to English is fast creating a bilingual nation. Bilingualism has become so prevalent that Spanglish is now used at all levels of society. This linguistic phenomenon can only happen where English and Spanish are in close contact, contending for the same linguistic space. Learning English, of course, has its practical side for Mexicans. Bilinguals in Mexico are more likely to be hired for higher paying positions in the tourist industry or in the multinationals that do business in the country. This linguistic turn is clearly a corollary of globalization, and Mexicans have been quick to recognize that bilingualism, especially English and Spanish, is the wave of the future for Mexico. Linguists have always argued that languages shape a person's worldview, reality, and identity. This being the case, isn't it possible to say that there has been a shift in bilingual Mexicans to a different reality and identity? I certainly think changes are happening. There are similarities and differences between bilingual communities in Mexico and the United States. Mexican-American bilinguals are English dominant and want to maintain Spanish as much as possible. They want to see their reality through Spanish and be shaped by it. While in Mexico, most bilinguals are Spanish dominant, but appear to have a strong desire to experience reality through English. The big difference between these two, the Mexican Americans and the Mexicans in Mexico, is that a greater number of Mexican Americans tend to resist being defined through American culture and English use. They want to be associated with Mexican culture and Spanish language. Mexicans, on the other hand, show little, if any, resistance. They want to be associated with English and are willingly running into the arms of American culture. The crux of the matter here is that Mexicans seem to be learning culture, attaining an identity, learning to socialize, and to build communities by watching American television and films, the internet, and lately social media. These are the means by which many Mexicans acquire their values, morals, standards of living, and being in the world, a world that always appears to be more American. I'm not saying all Mexicans are doing this, of course. Many residents in countryside towns demonstrate less of these changes, but even in their small communities, you find the presence of American popular culture. What conclusion can we draw from all of this? In 2004, Samuel Huntington published a famous book, Who Are We? A highly controversial study, still cited by many critics as a prime example of American nativist thought. In the main, Huntington alleges that the U.S. is in danger of losing its cultural identity because of the millions of immigrants arriving every year from Latin America. These immigrants, goes the argument, adhere strongly to their culture and fail to assimilate. The result could be catastrophic for the U.S., as the failure to assimilate an ever-growing immigrant population could ultimately alter the cultural identity of Americans. If this came to pass, Huntington feared that the U.S. would become a dual nation in respect to people, culture, and language. In Replenish Ethnicity, Tomás Jiménez from Stanford University refutes this argument Tomas refused this argument convincingly by demonstrating that Mexican Americans have been assimilating much more than seems to be the case. The reason it may appear otherwise is on account of the continuous migrations arriving every year from Mexico. These arrivals help to replenish Mexican American identity as they replace residents from the community that have assimilated into American society. Thus, the erroneous belief that Mexicans do not assimilate in the US. I, however, in my craziness, I suggest an alternative, unorthodox approach to refute Huntington's argument, which I find ridiculous. It consists of offering to give a tour of Mexico to Americans, especially those who hold those views. No, those who are scared that immigrants from Mexico and Latin America will change their cherished American way of life. I would take a group of them down there. I would guide them through the many malls, supermarkets, bars, discos, restaurants, movie theaters, etc., that dot the urban landscape. After a week of touring through these globalized spaces in Mexico, all doubters surely would be convinced that perhaps many of these Mexicans are as American as baseball and apple pie. They will realize that these are the people who will comprise future immigrant waves to the US. Yes, they're still Mexican, but they have embraced American popular culture. Thus, they will arrive, if not assimilated, at least acculturated to American cultural life. And for that reason, they should not be feared by Americans, but welcome in the US with open arms and open borders, of course. And as long as Americans don't play the race card, everything will be all right. Thank you. We do have a few, if anybody has a question, if you want me to clarify any points, I would like to just show you some. These are the Mexicans. These guys crack me up, although I'm one of them. But I love to go to games like this, when this happened, because I was telling my brother-in-law, Nick, that you can sit with anybody in Mexico, any of my friends in Cuernavaca, and they will talk to you about the Chiefs' last game on Monday night. And they start citing the statistics of Mahomes, the statistics of Kelsey, all kinds of stuff. And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know any of this shit. I don't follow it that closely. I did that back when the Browns were still the Browns, like way back with Kosar and some other, but now I'm too busy to follow that close, But they know it, and it amazes me. It just amazes me how much they know. Right now, I talked to a friend before I came here a couple of days ago from Cuernavaca. He's wanted to go into who do you think is going to win the World Series? I said, I don't even know who the hell's in the playoffs. And he already know, and he's already predicting, this stuff. And I'm like, I got other things to do. I'm going to talk about Latinos in Ohio. But this is who they look like, these guys who embrace Mexican culture. I show these pictures to my students. I'm teaching a course on Lima, Mexico City, and Buenos Aires. And I showed people what the middle and upper class looks like in these cities. And the students look at these people, and they obviously are very surprised. And I say, they look just like you, don't they? And my student says, yes, they do look like us. So because they imitate you. This is a mall. I always tell people Mexico has the best malls in the world. As I look at this and I remember the Southern Park Mall, and I said, no, it's nothing. You imagine? And if you walk around in all of these stores, people speak in English. I mean, if you walk in and you're like struggling to communicate in Spanish, just switch to English. And they will talk to you. They will be happy, very, very happy to, my daughter worked, my daughter Alasne, she worked about, I don't know, 10 years ago in Forever 21, is that what it's called? Yeah, she worked there. And one day, just to show Mexicans come to California, to Houston, they make special trips to buy clothes from the US. And my daughter's working there, and several times she comes to me, there's a guy here from Mexico. I don't understand what he's saying. What does this word mean? And I would tell her. And then she said, one guy says, this guy, I'm a little uncomfortable. I said, why? He goes, he's trying to put the clothes on me, like, let's say, my daughter's your age. And, and so she goes, is that right? I said, don't worry about it. So anyways, she sent me a message and says, the guy bought $900 worth of clothes. Now, I have friends who come to the Bay Area to recruit students to study in Mexico. And every time they come, I said, hey, let's go hang out somewhere, some bar, and have some drinks. I said, are there any outlets nearby? And I said, yeah, there's outlets. You want to go? Yeah, we go there. And they're texting people in Mexico. I found the Uggs that you want, but it's only blue, or they're only beige. Which color do you want? And now it's even worse. They take pictures. This is what it is. Do you like it? And they buy and buy and buy. They take it. They bought into it. But like I said, I'm not saying that they're not Mexicans. It's just that they're acculturated. Just like when I came here and I found my relatives here and others, they were acculturated into American culture. But the Mexican was still there. And we could see them at the picnics. We could see them at the dances, Cinco de Mayo. We could see them, or even in Santa Rosa de Lima with Puerto Ricans, the mass, all the other things. It was ours. It was our mass. It was our way of approaching religion. Okay? You have a question? It's cool.
I do. Bienvenido y muchísimas gracias for a very thoughtful, instructive lecture. I wonder, por favor, if you would speculate as to the flow of immigration, say, the next 5 to 10 years. Latin American immigration.
Yeah. It will continue to come. It will continue. I'm sorry. It will continue to come because, unfortunately, the so-called root causes are deep, really, really deep. Okay? We have countries full of bad governments, especially in Central America, Mexico too. We have very bad governments. We have not developed the economies the way we should have. We've squandered whatever help we get from other countries that are generous and send money. Few people are the ones that steal that money. No? Very few people. And the majority of people are in a situation that it cannot hold. The other thing is, and this is where I always say, Americans were lucky that globalization meant the spread of popular culture from the US. You have no idea how much that attracts Mexicans and others. They want to come here. I mean, they have a strong attraction, and you can tell them, it's a racist country. There's a lot of problems, in the society. And they said, I don't see that. All I see is all these people coming back from the U.S. to visit my little town with all of these improvements in their clothing, in their houses, in education. Their children are going to college, And so that globalization, watching all those movies, they feel that they should attain that should be, I know they call it the American dream, but they feel that they should have that chance. So it's not going to be easy to stop it because there's a pull. The pull factors usually are jobs, But this time the pull factor is also Hollywood films, social media, technology. All of that is pulling them to the U.S. and they want it. And obviously, I find it unethical to say, no, you cannot have it. I'm the only one who should have this life. But you got to stay in your town and live the poor life. And they say, what, didn't your father take you over there? And that's, one of the cool things that I always say, our parents, everybody here who's our immigrants, I know in our case, our parents brought us here to better the family. And all immigrants in Latin America who are coming, not all, I would say, but the vast majority of them, want that chance for their children. They see their children and say, we're going to live in this squalor. And they know that if they can make that trek and make that and just make it to the U.S., it's not like, oh, I'm going to live the good life. I'm going to, live in the single life and all that stuff. No, they're thinking of their children. They want their children to get that education and to have a better life. One of the coolest things in my university is when I meet parents, and every single parent who has come to the U.S., undocumented or documented, they all have one thing in mind. They say, this is my goal. I want my daughter to become a doctor. I want my son to become a lawyer. I want my kid to become a teacher. And they push them. This is where the possibilities are. Our countries are in dire straits. It's sad. You look at El Salvador, who for years was being run by the Mara Salvatrucha gangs. Until this Bukele came and did some illegal stuff, not illegal, but, highly questionable means. But he had to do it. In other countries, Mexico is pretty much in the same situation. People want to leave because, they see narco is controlling more and more of Mexico. And it's sad because it affects the people. And so many people want to get out. They want to get out. And they look at the U.S. and say, the U.S. is a strong nation. Even though the U.S. is kind of in decline in some respects, they see it as paradise. And you can tell them, don't look at the TV and believe that that's the way life is, or don't look at the movie and think that's the way life is. And they'll say, I know it's hard. You got to work hard in the U.S. I know. But they want to do it. And that's why when people say, why do they make that trek by foot all the way from Venezuela, all the way from Costa Rica, from wherever they're coming? Because it's like Martin Luther King said, keep your eyes on the prize. Just keep your eyes on the prize. And the prize is my kids are going to have a better life. Not me. Not me. I would say my parents did not enjoy life the way I'm enjoying it, materially. Materially, they did not enjoy it. And it was like, no, I want you guys to get up there and have a better life. And they left this world, I hope, happy, saying, hey, I wish my mom and dad were together, and when they met each other up there in heaven, whatever, and they went a little fist bump. Nice job. Nice job. We did it. We did it. You have a question? Cool.
You showed this lovely mall, and you said this is how the upper class live. But how many people are in this upper class as opposed to the people that can't afford to go to this mall? And is that driving people to immigrate? Because there's too many people who can't afford these luxuries and stuff.
It does. That's a good question. This is middle class and upper class. Middle class and upper class go to the mall. Okay. I have a blog somewhere around there called Postcards from a Post-Mexican. You're more than welcome to look at it. I wrote one where I said about, I think the title was Mexicans Lost in the Supermarket, which was about how the mall culture in Mexico, it's not the same as here. When I went to California, it was right when Valley Girl was a very big hit. It was the mall culture of California, no? With the Valley Girls. It's not that type of mall culture. It's different. Over there, in the US, anyone can go into the mall. If you have money, if you got credit cards, you can go in. Over here, those are classes, very classes, no? And they go in there. What's interesting, people without money can go in there, but it's just to stroll. No, they just throw and look at it. You have that desire, but you cannot do it. But they know that in Mexico, the jobs, even though the president, Lopez Obrador, who just left, he doubled the minimum wage. I mean, it's not a lot. It went like from $5 to $10, no? But, and that's for a whole day. And so, of course, many of them have two choices. You can either say, we got to go somewhere. Because what I wrote about in that blog, I said, I love going to Sun Valley Mall near where I live for this reason. When I go around these malls, I walk around and I see these Mexicans, middle-class Mexicans, walking around by Sarah. I don't know if you guys know that store, Sarah and other stores that are very, nice. And many of the Mexicans in the middle class don't have that money, but they want to go there to be seen. It's a class thing. You want to go stroll around to be seen, and people say, oh, wow, he's one of us, right? The lower classes, when they show up, they're kind of mean to them. They're the ones that they follow around, and, they don't let you in some stores. So I say, when I go to the Sun Valley Mall in California, I like it. I go to Nordstrom, and there's these indigenous people from Oaxaca buying Nordstrom because they got the money. And they have more money than these guys, right? They have more money. But yet when those Indians go to one of these malls, they're like following them around saying, you don't have the means to be here. What are you doing here? Right? I mean, they're not saying that, but that's the attitude. So I love it in California when I see indigenous people from the countryside who are buying in Nordstrom, Macy's, and all those stores that are very expensive, And they walk by me and I smell that perfume that is expensive as hell. And I said, that's pretty cool. But these people, if they go to this mall, they're discriminated. I think he asked that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're okay.
They couldn't get a cab. They have those fancy cars, old cars, and because they're brown skinned, and the young man that was taking them says, you can't get a cab because they think you're Cuban.
Yeah.
They didn't want a Cuban. They wanted a rich American.
It's true. But like I said, Mexicans are now learning that a lot of the communities from the countryside have a lot of money. That they come to the U.S. and they are making a lot more than the Mexicans are making. I mean, that indigenous people buying a Nordstrom is making more money than many of these people who walk around this mall. Okay? A lot more. Let's say that they clean houses, some stereotypical thing, that they clean houses. They may be making $60,000 a year. That's a hell of a lot more than these people make. And they have the buying power. But when they go over there, they're not seen that way. No? Go ahead. I don't know if I answered your question. I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
I have a lot of questions to ask, but I'll narrow it to two. Because a lot of this immigration, this illegal immigration that's going on is not just Mexican.
No.
It's Central America, even down into South America. Do you have a sense of how much is non-Mexican, but Latino, that come through illegally? And what is the actual process and cost of doing it legally?
Well, there's more proportion of Central Americans and Venezuelans. Venezuelans lately, because of Maduro's terrible government, he has caused a huge exodus, millions of people of Venezuela. Not all of them have come here. The one thing that I like about when we talk about Venezuelans, the media picks up on the criminals. And they said, oh, these Venezuelan criminals are doing this. They took over this apartment complex in Colorado. The vast majority, like I said, they just want to have a better life. That's all, no? There's an increase from that part. There's an increase from Central America. El Salvador, there's already about 1/3 of El Salvador lives in the U.S. 10% of Mexicans live in the U.S. When I say Mexicans, I'm talking about born in Mexico. Ever since, for the past 100 years, 10% of Mexicans have lived here. Now, when I gave you the statistics, it still showed that Mexicans are the ones that are the biggest group, 60% of the Latinos, no? But I think that Central Americans are now much more than Mexicans because the Mexican economy has gotten a little better with this raise in the minimum wage. Plus, the only problem, obviously, in Mexico, the one big problem people don't talk about is the narco. Okay? If the narco would be out of the way, Mexico would be in a much better place economically. But for the last, oh my God, it's been about 10 years, maybe more. For a while, Mexican people who came and who left it at even, meaning there was no increase in population of Mexicans in the US. Lately, because the economy got a little bad, they started more. But the vast majority are coming from Honduras, from Cuba, from Nicaragua, no, Panama. They're coming from Central America. That's where they're coming. Quite a few. But at least from 2022, which I gave you the statistics, it still doesn't show them as surging way up, no? But Mexicans sometimes pride themselves in saying, we don't go to the US anymore because Mexico now has a country that's more stable economically. For a while, it was kind of like, they crowed about it a lot, but it's going back. But still, even if small numbers of Mexicans come, there's 130 million Mexicans. So if a small number then comes, it's more than all of Central America who's coming. No, it's still the bigger part that it is arriving. You had another question, I think that, I don't know if I answered it. Yes. The process legally is cumbersome. Yeah, I'll give you an example. When we came in 1966, right? My dad got his, in 1964, I think it's Hart-McClellan Act, the one that ended the Bracero program in 64. What they did was they gave the Braceros who had been working in the US for several years, they gave them residence, no? So my dad, you had to prove it. You had to prove that. And my dad could prove it. The people write letters, the ranchers saying, he worked for me for 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, and he got his residency. So in 65, he was a resident. And he came to California, worked all over the place, Paso Robles, Modesto, Salinas, a bunch of places. And then he went to Ohio to visit around this time, to visit my aunt, mi tío Tony. And my aunt was like 25 years older than my dad. She was much older than my dad. But what was cool about that trip, it changed us, because he decided to go over there. And obviously my aunt probably said, listen, if you want to bring your kids because you have that family reunification clause. And he said, yes. And she convinced him to go to Ohio. So we're talking in December, right? He goes back to Mexico and he filled out the application process. We got a date to go to the embassy very quickly. It might have been a month. That's what it took. And we went then, all of us except my brother Carlos, he was studying in a normal school to be a teacher. But the rest of us, we all went to Mexico City and did the process. It took us maybe a week to be there. They send you first, you go to embassy and they did the physical, just like Ellis Island, where they do the physical and everything. And then you would go to get a passport and you bring back all those documents. And during those 3 days or whatever that we were there, when we left, we knew we got approved. We already knew. So,
But it's not like that now.
no, but I was going to say a month later, or maybe a month and a half later, we were crossing the border. My dad put us on a Mexican Greyhound kind of bus. 7 kids and mom and dad. And somehow, I don't know how the hell he did it, but he brought us all over here. He didn't speak English. My mom didn't speak English. We didn't speak English. I was used to joke around with my dad, say, if you would have left one in St. Louis, Missouri, you still would have came with 6. That was a win. You know, you still did a lot. But nowadays, that's how it was. For many of our friends that Gloria remembers, Carlos remembers, our generation, the parents who were braceros and got their green cards, right away they brought their families to California to work in the fields. No, we came to study. We escaped that. Now, it may take as much as 10 years. It's glutted. It's glutted. And the Americans, the bureaucracy has grown. It's gotten more expensive. Now that it created a culture of lawyers who help you, who cut in line, who you pay them a bunch of, $10,000 and they know people inside, because there's a lot of corruption, even in the US. And you go in there, they cut in line, and they cut you in line so you can get it faster. Okay, so 10 years. So it just, when I think about us going to Mexico City for more or less a week, and then we're back and like, hey, we're going to the US, to now somebody sending, and hopefully I'll get a date to go to the embassy one of these days. And there's a lot more paperwork, a lot more, especially after 9/11, a lot more. They vet you like crazy. So you have a question over there. I hope I answer your question, man. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry for a second question. There's so much to talk about on this. Root causes do push people out in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and so on. I'd like to suggest that some of the root causes are not in El Salvador, but they're here.
Yeah, they are.
For example, NAFTA
Yeah.
is one. And another one is our insatiable desire for drugs. We're the market.
Well, it's drug and cheap labor. Drug and cheap labor.
Right.
That's what it is. Well, that's the thing that Americans sometimes don't realize. That's what I was saying. They don't realize that globalization, which they spread, they open it through the GATT agreements back in the 80s and 90s. These GATT agreements that were opening the borders. And at the time, I was in college when that was happening. I really didn't understand what the hell that meant, the GATT agreements. But everybody was talking about how it was going to transform the world. And all of a sudden, 4 years later, boom, NAFTA hit, and all of us realized. We realized that means American culture is so, not the products. American products are so strong, and they just went out all over the world. But the popular cultural products were essential because when they went out, they created the pull factor. No? And I was explaining to my sister the other day, I said, what's interesting about the pull factor in that sense, like you're talking, the drug business also works like this. For globalization, we let illegals or undocumented come over here, or they have to come. They let them in. You have to let them in because the workforce needs them. Okay, they come in, then they work hard to create products over here. They send them to Mexico, without any tariffs. And then, because the U.S. wants a market there, it creates a market. Those people don't have money. So then the people working over here send the monthly money so that they can buy those products. You see? So then it's kind of a circular thing where you come over here, you create the product, and then you send your relatives over there to buy the product that you made. And what the U.S. paid you said that the U.S. paid you to create that product, they know that you're going to send that money that they're paying you over there, and they recuperate it. It comes back to the U.S. So that's a win-win situation for the U.S. And on top of that, you're creating people who want to come over here, and when they come here, they love American culture so much. And I don't mean that they're not Mexicans. It's that they like the culture, the popular culture. They come here and they spend a whole bunch of money. They spend like crazy. And when people say they don't pay taxes, I said, go to those stores and see how much they buy. They pay a lot of taxes and also income tax. But the market is so big. And lately, targeted them. The people that are targeting the Latinos right now is football in the U.S. They are targeting Latinos. And they're showing how Latinos are huge fans of the American football. And they're the ones that are buying the most. You know, the jerseys and hats, like those guys, no? And you buy a jersey, it's $300. You buy a jacket, it's like $400. I mean, people, always say, I wear some of my Raider stuff, and my students say, "Oh, where'd you get that?" I said, "In the black market in Mexico." You pay $10. And there are clones. You cannot tell the difference. They're clones. No, but they're targeting them right now. And they are targeting in other ways. The Americans but they're very good at taking ethnic holidays and turning them into money makers. And so the latest one for us, at least for us in Mexico, is Dia de los Muertos. They have taken Dia de los Muertos and converted it into a massive capitalist enterprise. And I always tell my students, you know what's happening? Those muertos in their graves are turning in their graves. Like, what the hell? You guys are making money out of my dead? It's just ridiculous. It's amazing how they turned that. So the Americans, that's, again, root causes. It's a root cause. Because they want to come over here, no? But for me, one of the most interesting things, just to show you, and I left this for dramatic effect. It affects everybody. I say, the smaller villages or towns, they may not be as much affected by the American popular culture that has spread all over. And Mexico is not the only country, by the way. You find that everywhere. You go to Cuba, you go to Nicaragua, my friends from Romania, from Italy, everywhere complaining. They're all complaining about American culture being in their faces. All their young people want it, okay? But in Mexico, some people sometimes say, but in the small towns, it's not that bad. I said, no, the small towns it's interestingly, we in the 60s, or not in the 60s, 70s, when we began to return, we began to take the American culture there. When we returned. When I showed up with those Levi's and my friends were wearing these cheap clothes from Mexico, and they're like, wow, Levi's. When I had my hoodie, which were not called hoodies then, they were like, wow, that's an American clothes. No, you're already bringing it in. When the first person brought to my hometown the first television, which was a 13-inch black and white, it changed. It's like bringing the snake into the Garden of Eden. It changed, okay? So our towns, small towns, are changing too. But this last one is a little sad, but interesting. Here you have it. Arts and crafts, Mexican, right? I forgot, what's your mark saying? Art, Mexican, arts and crafts? Why? No, I don't care. This is my buddy. This is my favorite Spider-Man. When I lived in Mexico as a little kid, I used to read Spider-Man comic books. El Hombre Araña. I read it. And when I came here, I was confused, like, why the hell is Spider-Man talking in Spanish? Anyways, over here, you got, who is this? Belle. Look at the little girl, the Indian girl. These are Indian girls. Indian. They are not mixed. Look what she's wearing. Frozen. Frozen is one of the most popular films in Mexico. I've gone to so many birthday parties. My friends invite me for a day. We're going to have a birthday party for a daughter. And no, they're friends. Hey, she wants something frozen. I heard something that has to do with that's the theme, and she wants gifts for Frozen. And I'll go with one of my friends. I don't want to choose something. We get to Sears. Go to Sears, and my friend says, oh, look, the Frozen stuff over there. I said, no, I'm going to get a regular dress. I'm buying her dress. I'm not going to buy her some Frozen. And then you get to a party, Frozen, the things on the table. frozen piñata, frozen cups, frozen spoons, everything. But if you look at it, it's very interesting. These are the stuff that they make in my hometown, made of home state, made of wood. If you look at them, they got Disney. Again, frozen. Right there. These are the stuff that my sister Gloria used to play with. But they were not painted like this. And I'm like, they're there. No, Mickey. And then what's interesting, and I wish I think that, I was trying to get her to stand up and take a better picture, but she's very shy. And the other two little girls, they look like they just wanted to steal something. I want Elsa. You know? No, what's really interesting, the very last one is that, and we did something, is that, I caught my idol. I wish I had been further back, because I got up very close to them and trying to, I took many pictures. I was trying to get a good shot, but they were not participating. The big thing is there. Hanging over old American. But it's so, I love that. I love the little girls. They're like so intense, like which one you like next? What was Elsa? What was the other one? Anna. Yeah, like, I'm for Anna. Oh, I want the evil one. I want Elsa. No, but that's it. Just give you like a very good idea of what Mexico is. Now, somebody says, are these Mexican kids? Yeah, they're Mexican kids. They're Mexican. It's just that the culture has changed. That's all. So it's still Mexican. Okay? Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you.
Dr. Ramirez, I know there was a question about the cost and the process to get a residency, so I wanted to address your question because I think it's important. It's changed so much from, your story and your parents, and I can tell you about, I don't know, I've been in the U.S. longer than I'm from Peru, so I've been here longer than I lived in Peru. So about 35 years ago, when I became a resident, the application was about $150.
Yeah.
And that's what I paid for my mom too, when the time came that I could petition for her. Now, there's different levels. So it starts about $1,400, $1,400, upwards of $5,000, depending on the type of visa. And one thing that there is a misconception is that, residencies are not just sold, at consulates abroad or here. You have to qualify to become a resident. Either you're married to a United States citizen or a U.S. resident, or you are part of the quotas, that each country has. Or, for example, you are being petitioned through a job because you have unique professions or unique skills. Not just anyone can go up and get that visa to live here permanently. So that is the biggest misconception, if I can point to that, because so many people tell me, well, they're just undocumented because they choose to do that. That is not true.
No.
And also, even if someone qualifies, marries somebody that, is a citizen and their children are adults, they're out of luck at that point. And those children came when they were young, maybe. So it's very difficult, it's very complex. And then I love to look at statistics just to put things into perspective, right? So in this, they're predicting that for 2024, there will be around 34.7 million applications to become resident. Out of that, they're predicting that they will only be able to issue 1.1 million green cards. That means that 3 out of about 100 applicants will be approved. So that puts that into context. And also, in 96, there were only about 10 million people applying for a green card. So it's expensive. And then once, and there's a process, there's a waiting period. It could be average 1 to 6 years to become a temporary resident. And then you have to apply for the permanent residency, more money. And you have to do medical exams. And, if it's for you and your family, right? And then if you want to become a US citizen, that's another process, more money. So it's not just straightforward. And, like you said, mostly everyone is afraid of it. So they hire an attorney and they're very expensive. And then some people, don't know about it, are not informed. They don't have someone that can explain this to them, that don't speak the language. And some of them is because they want to learn how to speak the language, but they don't have the time because they're working many jobs to make ends meet. So I just wanted to give you that to keep in perspective in the back of your minds, to have information ready when people say to you, well, it's so easy to become legal.
It's a big money maker for the US. They make a lot of money in the process.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ramirez, for this wonderful presentation tonight. And to all of you for being here tonight, thank you so much. And I hope that you come out tomorrow back to YSU and Kilcawley Center. Tomorrow, it's our YSU Hispanic Heritage Celebration. It's a festival. It's a fun event where we will have music, dancers, cultural displays, vendors, and free food from 12 to 3. Please join us. Thank you.
¿Cómo está? Bien, bien, bien. ¿Cómo se llama? Yeah, for the book, right, yes. Yeah, porque bueno, Gabriel Palmer, yo soy cubano. Y Jim Donovan was the president. I say never, she's a very good friend of mine.